Good morning. I'm Neha Man, a UX designer and researcher. This video is to share my contribution to DMI's Academic Design Management Conference. I co-authored this paper with my mentor, Professor Brooke Brandui. My paper is titled From Self-Advocacy to Public History, and I will be discussing how I developed a process framework to build collaborative capacity among remote communities. This study was a part of my graduate thesis at the Masters of Design program, University of Cincinnati. Before I begin, I wanted to establish two definitions for terminology I will be using frequently through this presentation. First, self-advocacy. Self-advocacy is the action of representing oneself or one's views and interests. Every community contributes to shaping society and hence merits a place in public history. Some communities are often excluded from knowledge production due to the trivialization of their contributions or their marginalization. Such communities need to advocate for themselves and publish their own narratives. Public history is differentiated from archival of facts in that it must present special insights accessible and useful to the public. This study is rooted in this opportunity of preserving pivotal social movements in the form of public history. The focus was to facilitate the transformation of individual voices into collective action. The end of 2019 and early 2020 witnessed massive unrest in Indian politics. The Parliament of India passed the Citizenship Amendment Bill, which altered the grounds for acquiring Indian citizenship. The country sprung in dissent as the demonstrators feared the new law endangered the nation's Muslim minority and are a threat to the secular values of the Constitution. The combined passing of this law with an announcement of a nationwide national registry of citizens resulted in a wave of protests and sit-ins across the country and among Indian diaspora around the world. Soon, the growth of these protests became unmanageable and protesters were met with police brutality in many places. Even some civilian groups contributed to religiously driven violence, in many cases resulting in fatalities. Among this turmoil, an incredible movement emerged. Women were found at the forefront of this movement. Propelled by these repeated injustices, women across India united to form what is now known as the longest sustained political agitation led by women in independent India. This group of women organized a 24-hour sit-in at Shaheen Bagh in New Delhi. They used non-violent resistance for 101 days until 24th March 2020 when Delhi police vacated the site due to pandemic regulations. One of the most striking images that came out of the protests is from Bengaluru, where women formed a circle around men to protect them from the police. They stood empowered by the fact that the Criminal Procedure Code prohibits the arrest of women between sunrise and sunset. The mass surgeons documented women in such protective roles across the country. It is also known that police brutality on men is far more normalized, as only female police officers are allowed to handle women. It is fascinating to know that all these mass movements were being organized completely through social media. People were not only coordinating online, but some even made attempts at formally documenting the proceedings of these protests in the form of websites and Excel sheets. To me, these were the first attempts at prolonging these movements as public history. So the question arose, how do we collect these voices? Moreover, how do we involve this sporadic conversation into a thoughtful dialogue with rich and varying perspectives? Most importantly, I was concerned with what happens once these protests pacify. This really was the inspiration of my study, to find and test methods that help produce public history. So the first step was to learn how to develop a community-built archive. More specifically, the community-built archive of women leading social activism in India. The study started with the development of a long quantitative online survey that was aimed to gauge the perceptions and first-hand experiences of people participating in these protests. However, it was structured in a format that invited responses from highly active participants as well as people distancing themselves from the movement. It was made in Hindi and English to be accessible to a wider population of Indians. It was also followed by a secondary survey that requested continued participation in the following phases. The responses from the survey were plotted on a framework and classified under high to low involvement in activism. The second part of the study was to learn how to interpret this collected data into public history. Once again, public history must provide special insights and be accessible and useful to the public. To explore the methods to interpret this data, an interpretation kit was prepared. This was sent to a focus group of women who volunteered their information for this phase. The kit contained a shuffled set of 15 responses from the survey, and the participants were instructed to find shared experiences among them. They were given visual examples to follow step by step and develop handmade posters. 4 different versions of this kit were made for 4 groups of participants based on their involvement in activism. The first was highly involved and physically reachable. These were people who I could physically mail these kits to. What you see in front of you is a participant response. This group had the quickest response time as the material was already sent to them and along with all the stationery that was required for the activity. The second group was highly involved and distant, so they received a digital kit. This group had a low and slow response rate as they had to print and perform the activity and arrange their own material. The third group was the mid involvement group, which had a single participant. This person was sent another version of the analog kit. They responded quickly and said the activity was not challenging enough. The fourth and final group was unaware and proximal. It was a group of my peers here in the US who weren't familiar with Indian politics. This workshop style activity was conducted to experiment if the same data can be used to educate unfamiliar subjects about a topic like this. Even though the participants successfully completed the study, they expressed a low understanding of the subject still. Additionally, they suggested that information could be provided at the end to clarify all the questions that arise through the exposure to the topic in the activity. As a result of these experiments, I was able to propose a systematic approach to self advocacy. The process framework consists of 6 steps. However, today I will be sharing only 3 as they were the ones that were derived from this study. The first step for a community to self advocate is to identify topical connections. A community may do that in 2 ways. They may self identify, where a community connects through shared interests or circumstances. This is commonly done online through social media. Or an external organization may also aid in the unification of a community. This may be done by an organization to benefit the community or to benefit with them through their visibilization. In this study, participants self identified as activists or otherwise when responding to the initial survey. The second step is collecting primary qualitative data. This was done with the help of the online survey. The activity of collecting data in the form of conversations, autobiographies, memoirs, and shared dialogue is the foundation of design led advocacy. Methods like semi structured interviews or qualitative surveys can be used. Once the data is collected, it needs to be organized into usable formats. For an oral history project, interviews must be transcribed, files stored, and notes digitized before the interpretation phase. This project utilized a digital survey and developed a framework for organizing the responses. Once the data is documented in written or audio formats, it has to be interpreted into public history. Interpretation is identifying and highlighting shared experiences among a pool of collected data. It is helpful to plot the responses in a framework that visualizes these connections. Interpretation is a collaborative effort between the participants and researcher. This phase is critical for remote participants to build the topical connection with other participants through the activity. Reading others' responses to the same questions can validate, substantiate, or clarify the participant's own response. This process enables remote connectedness through the interpretation of the collective experiences. The transformational aim of the study was to turn individual voices into collective action. In the process of collecting and interpreting data, the methods were targeted at building solidarity among the participants. It was evident from the process that each step requires a facilitator, and hence, for future work, a digital tool is proposed as a neutral facilitator of the process. It could allow remote collaboration with the participants still being the decision makers. The complete process framework was developed by combining two case studies: Women Leading Political Activism in India, which is the one I shared today, and Women's History of HIV in America. This paper focuses on the process from data collection to interpretation, but my thesis explains the complete process from collection to dissemination of public history. Some of my takeaways were that the execution of the framework is a slow endeavor. It relies on committed participation from multiple participants. The remote interpretation focus group activity requires much more time than an in person workshop session. I also learned that a community needs a core group. The challenges of a remote community really lie in coordination and fluctuating responsibility. In order to navigate the extensive process of self advocacy, a community needs to find that core group that is central to this task. As discussed in the framework, a process can start with a single person who, accompanied by a small group, can reach the masses. That is all from me today. I would take a minute to introduce the team. Professor Brooke Brandui is an assistant professor at University of Cincinnati and also my mentor. I'm Neha Man, a UX designer and researcher. My work can be accessed at nehaman.com. Both of our email addresses are written below if anyone wants to get in touch. I'm present at the conference today and I'll be happy to take any questions. And thank you, DMI, for connecting us all virtually. Thank you.